I was thinking of making my own voiceover, but after doing a test I was cringed as fuck by my own recording, so there you go, TTS for you all. This tutorial is specifically aimed at creating modded assets that have the closest possible resemblance to actual game assets. For this reason, I have prepared a Photoshop file with various bits and pieces I use the most to make ships textures. Mind you, these pieces are taken from the game's textures, so you cannot use them for any purpose that goes beyond this game. To start, we are going to make a 512 by 512 pixel image, as that is the common texture size for small vessels. Next, we are going to select the whole model, set side view and press U and select project from view. We are mostly going to use this function. In this case it is better to avoid using the Smart UV project tool because we need to have a great control over what goes where in the UV, and the project from view command allows us to do so. The first thing we can get out of the way is the hole's texture, as that is very easy and fast to make. We'll thus separate the whole projection from the superstructure, and project the stern separately not to have the texture stretched. We'll then make a new Photoshop document 512 by 512 pixels, as the image we made for the model's UV. And we'll paste the pre-cut hull texture we have in our asset collection. We'll put it in a corner to better use space. We can do the same for the red part below the waterline. We can now make a new material in Blender, and set the current Photoshop file as the texture image. This way we can just save the file without exporting anything and see the changes in Blender. We also need to have the red part separated from the rest, so we're going to make a horizontal cut in the model. Now we can separate the two parts and place them over the texture cuts we just pasted. To avoid having the whole projection occupy too much space on the UV, we are going to scale it to make its highest part fit nicely over the texture. We'll then split the projection in a number of segments that are going to overlay with one another. This way we can have a relatively high degree of detail while occupying a very small part of the UV. We'll do the same for the red part, but this time it's better to make the projection longer on the y-axis, since the side projection is actually quite deformed. Then we project the deck. In this case we can select a face and select similar faces according to the normal to be a bit faster. We'll split the projection in various parts to make them larger, considering the superstructure is quite small so its projection won't require much space. We'll then proceed by projecting the superstructure. I actually did a mistake here because I thought the ship was symmetrical while it wasn't. No big deal in this case, just consider that both sides will have the same texture. This might be an issue when baking ambient occlusion if there are different objects in other submodels insisting on one side relative to the other. If that's the case, and thus the ship is not symmetrical, it's better to project the faces separately and not having them overlay. This will of course occupy more space. I also projected the barriers separately cause I want them to have a certain texture that we'll get from the asset collection. The inside and outside will be separated too to have different textures. After we paste said assets in our file, it's quite important to immediately paste the associated normal map too, to avoid forgetting about it later. The other piece we pasted, with darker ends on top and at the bottom, will serve for the masts. Each segment of the mast needs to be rotated to be more or less vertical. Even if they have different lengths in the model, their UV must be of approximately the same length. We'll put all of these pieces onto that little piece we previously pasted in Photoshop. We can use the top part of the external barrier texture we pasted earlier to make a nicely detailed border for platforms and such. Then we can project the various flooring, considering they will likely have different textures. Most of them are just gonna be a flat color, so they can be smaller in the UV. Others, in this case the mast platform, will have a perforated metal texture, so they need to be a bit larger in the UV. It's very important here not to have anything overlaying, because we'll later bake ambient occlusion to add shadows and more depth to the texture, and the bake result will look like shit if you have overlaying faces. In this part I'm just placing minor details to use the existing texture as much as possible. If you really want to be a cool guy, you can project also the bottom faces, which in-game would be the undersides, to have their own texture and not some lame-ass flat color. In this part I'm just placing minor details to use the existing texture as much as possible. Now that we have more or less everything unwrapped correctly, we can mess around to have the most efficient layout, so that we maximize the space occupied by our islands without having unnecessary voids. Here the final layout will still look a bit empty due to the model being quite small and us recycling some textured parts from La Habitant boat. Be careful not to be too efficient. The size of doors, windows etc. that we're going to use for the texture is always the same. You can scale them, yes, but it's gonna be noticeable. Always try to use them without scaling them. If you want to, you can paste a door in Photoshop just to scale the islands accordingly. Now we can export the UV layout with the same size as the texture, put it in our texture folder and import it in Photoshop. If you link it, you can update it automatically should you happen to change the UV, which you will. We now start the real texturing. We'll start by painting the base color of the decks. In this case I'm copying the color from the Principe de Asturias texture. We'll first select a perimeter so that we only color within it. Then we paste the underside's texture. In this case I noticed that the relative island was too small, so I had to adjust it. We'll select the perimeter of the island and mask the pasted texture. If you copy and paste more than one to cover a larger area, you can group them and mask the group. Masking basically makes only the part within your selection visible. You can invert your selection by pressing Ctrl-Shift-I, if you want the previously selected part to be invisible now. Now we'll add a new layer with a base flat color. Then, we add some pieces to make the lower parts of the superstructure darker. They will end up looking darker anyway due to ambient occlusion, but with this one too they'll look better. Then we group them by faces and mask them so that only the parts actually covering the faces are visible. If you want to avoid the tiled look, you can overlay one tile on top of another, and then with a soft eraser make the edges more irregular so that adjacent tiles merge seamlessly. Now we add the windows. In this case the pasted ones weren't of the right size. So, I cut the central part, and then separated the two side pieces. I then stretched the central part horizontally to make the whole window wider. Same thing for the window's normals. The portholes needed to be scaled a bit. It's now time to add the doors. Here I realized that the ship was not symmetrical, so I had to adjust the position of the doors accordingly. Again, always put the associated normal as soon as possible. After placing the doors, make a group and mask it. Click on the mask and, with a soft black brush, delete the useless part of the door cut. On the texture you can paint with grayscale to modify it. Black covers more stuff, white uncovers it. We can do the same for the ladders. Since the one I pasted is too long, I masked it too. To add more detail, we'll add fire extinguishers close to the doors too. Since I was not satisfied with how the superstructure looked, I selected the top parts of the walls and used the Fill According to Content tool, to make it more textured and less flat. Now we add the grills, some of which ended up being where I placed the doors, so I removed them. For more detailing, we add the bars. In this case it's better to erase some parts as they don't really fit with the background color. We proceed by masking the whole group as we did previously and hide the parts where doors or other stuff is already present. This is done by selecting an area and editing the mask by painting those areas black. The side windows are not perfectly squared but follow the superstructure angle, so you can edit them by pressing Ctrl-T and then, by keeping Ctrl pressed, you can move individual vertexes of the selection box. Making the various tubes is actually a pretty simple process if done the proper way. We start by painting them as black lines, which will be important later. Make them a single pixel wide. Add a full white layer and export the resulting image. Only the black lines must be visible. Load the image in this website and use these settings to convert the image in a bump map. Paste it in your Photoshop file, at the bottom of the group with just normal components. Disable the white layer and apply two effects to your layer, Color Overlay and External Shadow. The first one is going to replace the black with another color, ideally the same flat color of the superstructure. The second one adds the shadow projected by the tubes onto the superstructure. Stop the video to copy the settings. To add more shadows, you can duplicate the layer, convert it to Smart Object, and then blur it in the Filter tab. Converting it to Smart Object allows you to change the filter settings that would otherwise be permanent. We'll then paste some random crap to add detailing to the back fosse of the bridge. In this case we will also add more tubes. Since the entire thing relies on effects applied to the layer, we can simply paint more black lines that will automatically be converted to a more pleasing look. The old bump map is now incorrect, so we'll repeat the process with the previous website. To make the front face of the bridge wheel straight up, copy a chunk of the combatant's texture. Oopsie. I changed some of the flooring texture above the superstructure to be lighter than the deck. We finally arrived to the ambient occlusion step. We'll need a new material in Blender, which we'll call OW. Within it, apart from the nodes which you can easily copy, there needs to be a new image with the same size. Add the texture. Once you have that, press on the image node, and go into the render section. To run some tests, I set the noise threshold to 1, plus a low number of samples. For testing, even 1 is okay. Then go into the bake section, select diffuse, color only, and bake. You must be using cycles to bake. Since I was not satisfied with the result, I messed around with the color ramp to change how dark black parts were. Once you're satisfied, save the image in your texture folder and link it in Photoshop. Select Multiply as blending option and set a transparency of 75%. This layer need to be on top of everything else that's in the diffuse group. We will mask out the parts where we had overlapping faces in the UV, as they look like shit. We can then duplicate the OW layer and apply a hue and saturation adjustment layer, to give it a more rusty color. This is for the deck only, so we'll mask out everything else. To get an uneven look, we can mess around with the mask using various brushes. Play with opacity too. We'll paint some rust here and there. There is no particular method here, just use more than one color, avoid sharp shapes and play, again, with opacity. To finish, we'll add some lighter outline to some faces. For the spec map, my method is only partial, as it only affects the specular map, or the color of reflections, while in-game the spec map also has a glossiness map embedded within the alpha channel, which tell how glossy the reflection is. White is mirror-like, black is more blurry. Personally, I've found this last step doesn't make much of a difference, and for the time being I'm fine with it. For the first part, we'll actually simply edit the diffuse group with a couple of adjustment layers. We'll also copy and mask the windows and portholes group, to make them whitish so that they are indeed reflective as glass.
And that's it. Hope you liked my TED Talk. Good luck with your future projects.